So why is tea not water? And why is this important to know and to be aware of? Well, of course tea is made of water, but it is not treated the same as water in our body. Let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at how our body recognizes its environment. Of course, we all know the common senses. We have taste, we have smell, we have touch, we have sight, we have balance, we have proprioception, we have a lot of means to know how our environment is forming and how it is influencing our body. We can sense this. In the same way, our gut, meaning our mouth, stomach, small intestine, big intestine, rectum, etc., have senses as well. Maybe not exactly the same as on our outside of our body, but they are senses. They sense what's going on in their environment. So, what are these senses in our gut? Well, there are a few, and I will name a few, which are quite important, meaning chemical senses, to sense any different kind of chemicals, H2O, CO2, etc., etc. It can sense what kind of chemicals goes in there. It has mechanical senses. How is our gut stretched? How much is in our gut? It can sense this and react to this. It has senses to sense osmolarity, meaning the proportion, the strongness of food or fluid, how much particles are dissolved in a fluid. It has senses to sense temperature. Is it cold? Is it hot? It will react to this as well. And it has senses to sense the acidity, meaning the pH of what comes in the gut. So why are these senses in our gut? Well, they are to prepare the body for reacting to what comes in the gut. Let's say we have a very big meal with a lot of stuff to be digested. Our body will treat what comes in differently than if we just have some tea, for example. Let's look at these senses a little bit closer with an example. Let's say on the one hand we have an Americano, a coffee which is a lot of water and not so much dissolved particles in it, or at least relatively to, on the other hand, let's say double espresso, which is less water and a lot of dissolved particles, a lot of caffeine, a lot of chemical compounds. Well, this enters our body, this enters our stomach, and our stomach will react or sense this, what comes in. Now, let's say the Americano will not it will stimulate, of course, these senses, chemically, osmolarity, but the Americano will mostly, relatively to a double espresso, mostly stimulate the mechanical, because it's a lot more water, it fills up the stomach much more, and therefore stimulate the mechanical receptors more than a double espresso, which is not much. It won't stimulate the mechanical receptors more, but the double espresso will stimulate the chemical and osmolarity receptors a lot more because of its higher proportion of dissolved particles. So with this example being said, what's the difference between tea and water? Well, water is the most neutral fluid that exists on this earth. It is very neutral in osmolarity and chemicals because it has not much dissolved particles in it. Of course, water has some dissolved particles in it, but relatively low. And also water has a very neutral pH, meaning that the acidity is very neutral. Let's take a look at tea, and we can already guess that because we need to put a tea bag in our water to get tea, this has a lot more dissolved particles. Actually, relatively to water, a lot more dissolved particles. And what does this do when it comes into our stomach? Well, our stomach will recognize water as very neutral and something not too needed to be digested. So it will just let this pass through. And when tea enters the stomach, it will be like, this is a lot more dissolved particles. I think we need to digest this. So it will treat this more like food and less like water. Now, what is this difference between these two? Well, water won't be digested, won't be treated as something that needs to be digested. So it's passed through the gates and can just fluidly go through the small intestine and make its way to the big intestine, where most of our flora or microorganisms are present. Tea, on the other hand, will be treated as something that needs to be digested because the stomach recognizes a lot more dissolved particles, meaning when it enters the small intestine, it will be treated as a food. So secretions will be let out, and the water from the tea that's within the tea will be absorbed already in the small intestine and not in the big intestine, or less in the big intestine. So what is this difference then? Well, everybody already kind of knows the importance of our gut microbiome, or the microorganisms that lives inside our gut. It is already known that it is a huge factor also in how our brain functions and the rest of our body. So when you have this flora, you have these microorganisms that need water and are dependent on their environment, meaning what comes into the gut, mostly the big intestine or the colon. It is dependent on this environment. So let's say we have a person that thinks, oh, well, I get my water from coffee and tea, doesn't drink any water. You can see how dried up these organisms are. This environment is not really optimal for these organisms to thrive. When you drink water, tap water, that's very neutral, this will arrive more in the big gut, the colon, and water our microorganisms more as well. So they will thrive there in this environment, which is highly rich in water. So if you think that I make this up, of course you don't have to believe me. I rather not you believe me. I rather you try something for yourself. There are two experiments. One is where the night before you go to bed, you make 2 glasses, one with water, just neutral tap water, and one with tea. Put it in the fridge, and then the next morning when you wake up, it will be really cold. First, take a sip of the cold water. Feel how it passes through your esophagus, goes down to your stomach, and there just passes through. You can feel it because it's cold. It's very sensitive to our stomach. And when you drink some tea after that, you will feel when it passes through the esophagus and in the stomach, it will stay there. You can feel this because it's really cold. You can feel that it won't be passed through the stomach immediately like the water you drank before you had the tea. Now the other experiment, because the first experiment does have one factor that is not very congruent with what I just told you about the senses, because remember, the temperature also matters. So with this cold water, it's already more stimulating the stomach. It will react more differently than when you have just plain tap water or water that's around room temperature. So the next experiment, but you will have to be more sensitive for this, is just to have tea and some room temperature water. Now, first drink some room temperature water. It's best to do this on an empty stomach because you will be able to feel it better. Drink some room temperature water and feel how it's just passed through everything. like I said, you need to be a bit more sensitive to this, but it is possible to sense it, and it is a more congruent with what I just told you about the receptors in our stomach and the rest of our gut. Now, drink some tea after this, and you will also notice that it is contained in the stomach and not passed through as easily as the water you just drank before it. So, with this told, maybe it'd be good to consider this and drink some more neutral water, because our stomach has evolved on this and is really has adapted towards these water or more dissolved particles in it. So remember, we are morphing beings. We either morph or we die. There's not much else in between. Drink your water, less tea, more water. I will see you in the next one.